This lecture introduces the pulmonary system or the respiratory system. Those terms are used rather interchangeably. So the mini lecture will first introduce you to the overall concepts and function of the pulmonary system, and then we'll look at some anatomy associated with the pulmonary system. So let's get started with some processes. So when we think about processes associated with the respiratory system, we first start with the movement of air in and out of the lungs. That is called ventilation. So ventilation is what we consider to be breathing. It involves moving air from out here into our lungs and pushing air from our lungs back out into the atmosphere. There are two phases associated with ventilation. They are inspiration, which is drawing air in, and expiration, which is pushing air out. Now, the whole goal of ventilation is to change the concentration gradients of both oxygen, or O2, and carbon dioxide, or CO2, in our lung air spaces to promote favorable gas exchange between the lung airspace and the blood. So once we cover ventilation, then we'll move into gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. This is moving oxygen from the airspace into the blood and moving CO2 from the blood back into the lung airspace. And then a third associated process is how oxygen and CO2 are transported in the blood. Let's start our overview of the respiratory system with the term. What is respiration? If you were to approach somebody on the street, staying at least 6 feet away with a mask preferably, and ask them, what is respiration? They would probably tell you something like breathing. Respiration is breathing. And in fact, that is what the layman tends to think of as respiration. But you have already seen this word. We have used it to describe the process of taking glucose or a fatty acid or a protein and breaking it down for ATP energy. That process, cellular respiration, consumes oxygen and produces CO2 as a byproduct. So are cellular respiration and what people think of as respiration linked in some way? And the answer is yes. Cellular respiration involves oxygen coming into the cells and being consumed and producing CO2 as a byproduct. So as you can see in this graph here, down at the bottom, in order for cellular respiration to occur, oxygen must go into the cells and then CO2 comes out of the cells. Well, that sounds a whole lot like what happens up here in our lungs. Oxygen comes into our lung, CO2 comes out of our lungs. So in fact, external respiration, what people think of as breathing and that gas exchange up at the lungs, is done to basically drive cellular respiration and then deal with the waste product of CO2. So now that we've covered the term respiration as associated with the respiratory system, let's talk about some major functions of the respiratory system. The first one that we just covered is probably the main one, which is bringing oxygen from the atmosphere down all the way into our cells to drive cellular respiration and getting rid of CO2 as a byproduct. However, there are other functions associated with the respiratory system, and one of the major other functions is maintaining blood pH. That's right. Your blood pH should be about 7.38 to 7.40, and it really does need to be maintained in that narrow of a range. So it turns out that the respiratory system plays a major role in maintaining your blood pH within that range. So that'll be something we'll look at in a future lecture. The respiratory system is also associated with speech, and then because we are moving air in and out, and because air contains debris and pathogens, we also have functions that are aimed to capture any microbes or debris and try to make sure that they get out of our body and not down into our lungs where they could cause pneumonia or a COVID-19 infection. So now that we've covered our two major functions of the respiratory system, gas exchange of oxygen and CO2 and blood pH, let's go back to the first one and look at the general pathway of oxygen as it goes from the atmosphere all the way down into the cells. So oxygen, of course, is most concentrated in the atmosphere. Oxygen through ventilation comes into the lung airspace. From the lung airspace, it goes into our pulmonary capillaries, where it then goes into the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins feed into the left side of the heart, and then from the left side of the heart, we have the systemic arteries, arterioles, and capillaries, and then that oxygen at the systemic capillaries is finally going to interface with the cells and dump that oxygen off to the cells where it will be consumed via cellular respiration. So now let's look at the CO2. So CO2 is produced in the cells as a byproduct of cellular respiration. CO2 is then going to move into the systemic capillaries, it will move into the systemic venules, veins, and then to the right side of the heart, where then it gets pumped out into the pulmonary arteries, arterioles, and finally at the pulmonary capillaries, it's going to move from the blood to the airspace, and then during ventilation, it is expired out into the atmosphere. So that's the basic pathway of oxygen and CO2. So at this point, we're going to switch gears and look at the anatomy of the respiratory system. So this is anatomy light. In other words, we're not looking at it in detail like we would in an anatomy course. This is a physiology course, so we look at it in as much detail as we need to understand the physiology. So we're going to start with the upper airways. There are two pathways for air to be drawn into the body, one of which is the nasal cavity, the other of which is the oral cavity. Now, of those two, one is easier or encounters less resistance than the other, and that is the oral cavity. It is much easier to be a mouth breather than it is to be a nose breather. And that is because inside the nasal cavities, you have all of these bony projections created by the ethmoid bones and the nasal conchae that end up conferring some resistance, so that when air gets drawn up into the nose, it can't immediately go down into the lungs, but rather kind of gets stuck and moves around a little bit. But this actually confers some hygienic properties to it. Namely, it warms the air up and it gives whatever debris you might be inhaling a chance to kind of get stuck up against the walls of your mucous membrane so that it's not aspirated down into your lungs. However, you also know that breathing through your nose is harder if you've ever tried to sprint or run for long distances at a high intensity. When your heart rate starts approaching 90 to 95% of its maximum heart rate, you'll notice that you stop breathing through your nose and switch to being a mouth breather, because it's just simply so much easier to draw air in through your mouth. All right. Once air is drawn in either through the nasal cavities or through the oral cavities, it goes to the throat, which is more formally known as the pharynx. I'm not a huge fan of this particular image here. The pharynx is actually more in this region here than it is where it's listed. But the pharynx, of course, is going to be the throat. And then from there we go into our larynx, which is also known as the voice box because it contains the vocal cords. And then from our larynx we go down into our trachea, also known as our windpipe. And you can see here that the larynx and trachea are supported by cartilage rings that keep the airways open. Now, once we get down from our trachea, then our trachea breaks off into two major airways. One goes to the right lung and the other goes to the left lung. And as this image over here shows, you can see that the airways continue to branch off and become smaller and smaller and smaller in diameter as you go farther and farther into the lungs. A useful analogy that I make is to consider that this airway branching pattern resembles an oak tree in the winter that has been flipped upside down. But I don't want you to imagine a barren one. I want you to imagine one that instead of leaves, it's covered in grapes or holly berries. And so if you envision that, you pretty much have a good idea about what the lung branching patterns look like. So the major trunk is going to be the trachea. The trachea, of course, is going to break off into big woody branches. The closer you are to the trunk, the bigger the branches are. So the first woody branches would be called primary bronchi, and then those woody branches bifurcate off into smaller and smaller and smaller woody branches until eventually you get to twigs. And the twigs, in our case, are going to be the little bronchi, more formally known as the bronchioles. So bronchioles are coated in smooth muscle. That's one of their features. And then the bronchioles are going to open up into these big airway sacs that again look like bunches of grapes, or they look like bunches of berries. And those are called the alveoli or alveolar sacs, or a singular is called alveolus. So again, the branching is just about moving air into a variety of alveolar sacs. So when we think about the respiratory system from a physiological standpoint, it is convenient to break it down based on its purpose. Most of the anatomical structures that I just covered are simply conduits to move air from here down into the alveoli. The alveoli and even some of the bronchioles are where the gas exchange happens. So this is the important part of where we're going to exchange CO2 and O2 between the air spaces and the blood. And you can see that here in this image, you can see just how close that blood is to those alveolar sacs. So you're really putting the blood and those air spaces right next to each other to maximize diffusion rates. So it can be convenient to designate airways that are just involved as conduits of air. So in other words, just involved in moving air from here to there and back again, as the conducting zone. And so the conducting zone is basically going to be everything that we just talked about, except alveoli and some of the bronchioles. Whereas the alveoli and what are called the terminal bronchioles actually participate in some gas exchange, and so we call those the respiratory system. So again, if we go back to our oak tree example, you can think of the respiratory zone as being the twigs and berries, where everything else, all the woody branches, is going to be the conducting zone. Okay, let's take a closer look at the alveoli, because this is going to be where the gas exchange happens. When we do a cutaway of the alveoli, we'll see right away that there's a couple different cell types in there. So first of all, you might notice that there's a lot of cupping going on, or lots of surface area in those alveoli. The surface area is going to be explored in a later lecture, but most of them you'll see are going to be just typical epithelial cells. In fact, what are called type 1 cells, which are just those simple squamous epithelial cells, thin, flat, one layer cells, are just involved in maximizing the exchange of CO2 and O2 between the alveoli and the underlying pulmonary capillary. And that image is shown really well over here, where when you look over here, you have the airspace and then the plasma. And you can see this is going to be the cell of the capillary, also a simple squamous cell, and this right here is the type 1 alveolus cell, or one that is there to just promote gas exchange. If you want to maximize the diffusion rate, you minimize the distance between two compartments. And so there's no better way to minimize the distance between two compartments than to make the cells separating those compartments as thin as possible. And as evidence how important it is to make these as thin as possible, the capillary epithelial cells and the type 1 epithelial cells share a basement membrane. So if you've not had anatomy yet, this is not relevant to you, but if you have, you may recall that all epithelial tissue has at least one layer of cells and then an anchoring piece underneath called the basement membrane. And each epithelial tissue should have their own, but that basement membrane adds extra bulk or distance. So to minimize the bulk, they actually share one. That is how important it is to keep the distance from here and here as thin as possible. So there's that shared basement membrane, which I think is really interesting. Okay, So that describes the type 1. Now the type 2 cells, and here's another view of it, the type 2 cells are going to be surfactant secreting cells. So these secrete something called surfactant. Now on an exam, I'm not going to use type 1 and type 2. I'm going to refer to them as simple squamous cells or surfactant secreting cells. Now the surfactant is involved in making sure that the alveoli stay open. And we are going to be covering this in a different lecture in more detail, especially because COVID-19 infects surfactant secreting cells. And much of the morbidity and in fact mortality associated with COVID-19 infections comes from the choice of what types of cells they infect. And that would be surfactant secreting cells. So we'll be looking at this in more detail a little bit later. But for now, it's enough to know that type 2 secretes surfactant, which is clearly critical, and type 1, simple squamous cells, are there to maximize diffusion rates for oxygen and CO2 between the alveoli and the underlying blood vessels. Okay, so now that we've looked at the histology of the alveoli, we're going to pull away and look at some other associated anatomical features. One anatomical feature to look at are the pleural membranes. So the pleural membranes are serous membrane, if you are familiar with that term from anatomy, that surround the lungs. There are two of them, an inner layer and an outer layer. Okay, so in this cross section here, you can clearly see the outer layer, which I'm highlighting, and then the inner layer there. So the inner layer is going to be attached to the actual alveoli in the blood vessels. So this is a layer that's basically glued or stitched to the lung tissue itself. The outer layer is attached to the thoracic cage. The thoracic cage is going to be the ribs, the sternum, and then also the diaphragm, which is going to come underneath. Now, these outer and inner pleural membranes are separated by fluid. And that fluid, which is a type of serous fluid, is such that it kind of sticks the two membranes together. And so this is going to play an important role in ventilation, and we'll be getting to that in the next lecture. So again, there's two pleural membranes surrounding the lung tissue. You can see there's some surrounding the heart there too. But the ones surrounding the lung tissue are going to play a super important role in ventilation. If you imagine that the pleural membrane is a big fat water balloon that's actually very malleable or soggy, and inside, instead of water, there's something called serous fluid, which is lubricating, so it allows those two walls to kind of slide back and forth without friction. And so we've got this balloon, and we're going to stick our lungs and kind of push our lungs down into this balloon, and that water balloon is going to surround the lung like you see here in this image. And that pretty much approximates how we get an inner layer that is going to be attached to the lung and an outer layer that is going to be attached to the thoracic cage. So in anatomy, you are asked to know the names of those inner and outer layers. They are visceral for the inner layer and parietal for the outer layer, respectively. In this class, I will not be using those terms, but if you have taken anatomy, it's a little blast from the past there to bring those terms back. All right, now that we've covered the pleural membranes, let's take a look at some associated muscles. So there are multiple muscles that all assist in what is known as respiration. Sometimes they're called respiratory muscles, but they really should be called ventilating muscles, because the ventilating muscles are involved in basically making the lungs go out and in and out and in, and that is what is going to drive the ventilation or the movement of air in and out of the lungs. We're just going to cover the three major ones. Perhaps the most important of all of these is the diaphragm. The diaphragm comes up underneath the lungs. There is a big flat muscle that when it's relaxed, it's actually a little bit more superior, and when it contracts, it pulls down. And because the diaphragm is attached, when it pulls down, it should stretch out the lungs as well. Likewise, your lungs are contained in a thoracic cage, and that thoracic cage includes a bunch of ribs, and the ribs all have muscles that connect one rib to the one underneath. Those muscles are called the intercostals, internal and external intercostals. And collectively, the intercostals are responsible for making the rib cage expand out and in and out and in. So if you take a really deep breath and you put your hands on your rib cage, you should feel your rib cage expand. And when you push all the air out, you should feel your rib cage compress or contract. All right, that ends our mini lecture covering the basic overview of the respiratory system and the anatomy.